forget monkeys and apes for a moment. What if the real key to understanding human culture's evolution lies, well, with fish?
I know, it sounds a bit wild, right? Especially given that, popular stereotype.
Yeah, the whole dim 3-second memory thing. But today, we're diving deep into some, frankly, mind-bending research. It really unravels this sophisticated, strategic world of social learning.
And in the most unexpected places. Specifically, yeah, we're talking about two closely related species of tiny fish.
So our mission for this deep dive, really, is to pull out these surprising facts, these fundamental insights from the latest research. Stuff that'll shortcut your understanding of how animals, and maybe even us, acquire knowledge.
Exactly. Because, as our sources reveal, there's extensive experimental data now showing that social learning, even in tradition, it's crucial for tons of fish species. Most of them are actually highly social.
Huh. So it's not just rigid genetic programming.
Not at all. Their behavior is incredibly flexible, adaptive. They're constantly adjusting, to exploit information, including what they pick up from watching other fish.
It's fascinating how perfect fish turn out to be as a model system for investigating this kind of thing, social learning. I mean, beyond the obvious stuff like being easy to manage in a lab.
Yeah.
What specifically makes them such a powerful lens for this complex behavior?
That's a great question. Well, they're relatively short lifespans, for one. And the ability to set up large replicate populations in a lab setting, that's huge.
Right, makes sense.
Think about it. It's extremely straightforward and frankly cheap compared to studying, say, chimpanzees or macaques.
Oh, definitely.
And this allows for this unprecedented level of experimental rigor. You can have multiple conditions, healthy sample sizes.
Which is exactly what you need when you're digging into group level stuff, like animal traditions.
Precisely. It really opens up avenues for understanding how something like culture can even evolve.
So this surprising journey into fish intelligence, it really kicked off back in the late 1990s, didn't it? With a researcher named Isabelle Coulon.
Yeah, a French behavioral ecologist. She arrived at Cambridge, and her work really initiated this whole line of investigation, focusing particularly on sticklebacks.
Sticklebacks. Okay, so if you're not familiar with them, they're a family, like 16 species, super common up in the northern hemisphere. And they're related to pipefish and seahorses, which is kind of cool.
Right. They're pretty distinctive, known for their spines and these bony armor plates instead of scales.
And they've been a favorite for biologists for ages, haven't they? Ethologists, evolutionary biologists.
Indeed. The research program we're exploring today, it's this long, protracted 20-year effort, really trying to get a handle on a fascinating difference in social learning between two very closely related stickleback species.
It's a great example of how science works, right? It's rarely one single experiment that solves the big questions.
Absolutely. It takes this extensive series of studies, each one just chipping away at the problem.
And Isabelle, she was particularly interested in something called public information use. That's the technical term.
Yeah, and it has a very specific meaning. It's basically an animal's ability to assess the quality of something, like how rich a food patch is.
Yeah.
Just by monitoring the success and failure of others, from a distance.
So they don't have to go check it out themselves, avoid the risks, the energy cost.
Exactly. Avoid predator exposure, save energy. At the time, many people thought this kind of, sophisticated assessment required pretty high intelligence. Isabelle wondered if fish could actually pull it off.
And here's where that classic science story element comes in. Serendipity.
Oh, absolutely. It played a defining role here. Isabelle originally set out to collect three-spined sticklebacks. That was the target species for her hypothesis.
Okay.
But she'd mostly worked with birds before, so she wasn't super familiar with the subtle visual differences between three spines and their close relatives, the nine-spined sticklebacks.
Ah, so she scooped up both by accident.
She inadvertently collected both species, yeah.
And because she had enough of both, they just decided, hey, let's test them both.
Pretty much, which honestly is such a powerful illustration of how these accidental discoveries can lead to massive breakthroughs.
Totally. If a seasoned fish researcher had done the collecting, they probably would have just stuck with the three spines, maybe found nothing interesting, and that could have been the end of it.
Exactly. But because they tested both, they stumbled onto these differences that were so absorbing, they kicked off decades of really fruitful research.
So tell us about Isabelle's experiment. It sounds simple but clever.
It was deceptively simple.
Yeah,
but brilliant in its design. She used just a standard 90-centimeter aquarium tank, divided into 3 sections with transparent partitions.
Okay, so fish could see through.
Right. At each end, she put an artificial feeder, simulating a food patch. Observer fish were placed one at a time in the middle section, and from there, they could watch 2 groups of 3 demonstrator fish being fed at the ends.
Right. And the key was the food delivery, wasn't it?
Crucially, yeah. Food went into one feeder, the rich patch, at 3 times the rate of the other, the poor patch.
Ah, okay.
Now, the observers could clearly see the demonstrator fish getting all excited, pecking, eating.
Yeah.
But they couldn't actually see the food itself.
So they had to judge based purely on the demonstrator's behavior. Clever.
Purely on the behavior. After a 10-minute observation period, the demonstrators were removed, the partitions lifted, and the observer fish was released.
And the idea was, if they're using public information.
Isabel reasoned, yeah, if they were capable of public information use, they'd distinguish between the patches just based on how the demonstrators acted.
So they should swim towards the rich patch, spend more time there.
That was the prediction. And what she found was, well, pretty clear and a bit astonishing.
What happened?
9-spine sticklebacks predominantly swam to the rich patch end and spent more time there, just like predicted.
Okay.
But the 3-spine sticklebacks, well, they showed no evident patch preferences at all, just swam around randomly.
Wow. So right away, this fundamental difference pops up.
Exactly. That was the first big hint.
But of course, in rigorous science, you don't just stop there. You've got to rule out other explanations.
Oh, absolutely. Isabel's team was meticulous. They ruled out everything from whether the specific demonstrator fish were somehow different.
Like maybe the 9-spine demonstrators were just more exciting to watch.
Right. So they swapped them, used 9 spines as demonstrators for 3 spines, and vice versa. Results didn't change.
Okay, so it wasn't the demonstrators themselves. What about, vision? Maybe 3 spines just couldn't see well enough.
Good question. They tested that too. Replicated the experiment, but just had 1 patch with feeding fish and 1 empty patch. 3 spines can tell the difference. They went to the patch with fish, so vision wasn't the issue.
So what else could it be? Smell.
That was the next thought. Maybe some olfactory cue. This led to Isabel's self-proclaimed favorite experiment. They used opaque partitions.
Ah, so they could only smell, not see.
Exactly. And in that setup, neither species favored the rich patch.
Okay, that seals it then. It had to be visual cues watching the feeding success.
Precisely. It wasn't about who was demonstrating, wasn't about basic perception like vision or smell. The 9 spines really could assess patch quality just by watching others feed. It pointed towards an inherent adaptive specialization in how 9 spines process that public information.
So this really started looking like a genuine adaptive specialization in social learning for 9 spines, but, one population isn't enough to make big claims.
Right. To make authoritative claims, they absolutely needed to test populations from different places all around the world.
And that's where Mike Webster came in over the next, 15 years?
Yeah, 15 years of dedicated work from Mike, who was a postdoc then. He really established the robustness of this species difference. It was a massive effort.
What did they find across all these different populations?
It was invariably the same pattern. It was remarkable. Whether they tested sticklebacks from right there in Cambridge, or Scotland, the Baltic, Canada, even Japan. 9 spines always showed public information use. 3 spines never did.
And did it matter if they were freshwater or marine, armored or not, high predation areas?
Mike tested all of that. Freshwater, marine, armored forms, spineless forms, fish from high and low predation sites. Didn't matter.
What about how they were raised? Lab versus wild.
Rearing conditions, whether they were lab-reared or wild-caught, the density they were kept at, environmental complexity seemed to have very little impact.
So it really looks like a deep, unlearned trait specific to the 9-spine species?
All the evidence pointed that way. A genuine adaptive specialization in social learning.
Okay, so we have this undeniable difference. 9 spines do it, 3 spines don't. But the big question is why? How could 2 species, so closely related, living similar lives, sharing a lot of the same cognition, how could they differ so specifically on this one thing?
That was the conundrum, and the answer incredibly didn't come from studying fish directly, but from anthropology and cultural evolution did.
Anthropology? Really? How does that connect?
Precisely. The puzzle was elegantly resolved by thinking about Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson's costly information hypothesis.
Okay, costly information.
Yeah, this idea, which they originally developed thinking about humans, basically suggests that animals should be more inclined to copy others when learning on their own through trial and error. What we call asocial learning is costly or risky.
Ah, okay. So if it's dangerous or takes too much time to figure things out yourself, it pays to watch others.
You got it. And this is highly relevant to our sticklebacks because the costs of learning socially differ dramatically between these two species, and it comes down to their bodies.
Their morphology, how so?
Exactly. Three-spine sticklebacks, like the name says, usually have three large dorsal spines. Plus, they've got this heavy-duty armor, these tough lateral plates.
Right, they look pretty well defended.
They are. Their defenses are so effective, there are actual reports of them surviving being eaten. Like, the spines get stuck in a predator's throat and they manage to escape.
Wow, okay.
So what this means is they can explore their environment, poke around, directly sample food patches in comparative safety. For three spines, learning for themselves isn't particularly costly or dangerous.
So they don't need to rely on copying others' success. They can afford to find out for themselves.
Pretty much. But nine-spine sticklebacks, they're a different story.
How are they different?
Well, they have about 9 spines, but they're small, offering much less protection. They also have fewer and thinner lateral plates. All this makes them significantly more vulnerable to predators.
So they're easier prey.
Definitely. Studies have actually shown that predatory fish prefer eating 9 spines over 3 spines if given a choice.
Okay, so they're riskier to be out and about.
Exactly. And because they're more vulnerable, 9 spines typically respond to threats by hiding, finding cover.
So this fits perfectly with that costly information hypothesis.
It aligns beautifully. For 9 spines, exploring the environment, sampling food patches through trial and error, it's risky enough to potentially incur real fitness costs, like getting eaten.
Right. So the hypothesis predicts that those higher costs should tip the balance, making them favor social learning, watching from safety.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this was backed up by Isabel's observation that when they were given cover in the experiment, the 9 spines spent more time hiding during that observation phase.
But they were still watching.
Oh, yeah. You could see their little heads poking out, carefully tracking the behavior of the demonstrators. It suggests natural selection has really fine-tuned their ability to extract that foraging information safely from a distance.
That's really clever, adaptively clever.
It is. But, you might be wondering, why did the 9 spines need to collect such detailed information on the actual feeding success, the payoffs? Couldn't they just use a simpler rule like swim to the patch with the most fish, assume more fish means more food?
Yeah, that seems simpler. Why not just follow the crowd?
Well, that kind of reasoning has at least 2 big problems. First, a patch might have had lots of visitors recently, right? But those animals would have eaten a bunch of the food already. It might be depleted.
Okay, makes sense. What's the second problem?
Second, animals that group together for safety, like shoaling fishes, don't always make foraging decisions independently. If everyone just follows the numbers, it can lead to what scientists call information cascades.
Information cascades, like everyone following everyone else, even if the initial decision wasn't optimal.
Exactly. Everyone follows the crowd, which, as you know, can sometimes lead to a less optimal outcome. Think of a restaurant that looks busy, but it's only because everyone's stuck waiting for a table, not because the food's actually amazing.
Right, got it. So relying only on numbers can be misleading.
It can be, and Isabel's experiments showed this beautifully. When 9-spine subjects were forced to choose based only on the number of fish at each patch, maybe no feeding cues were available, they did swim to the end with more fish. They'll use numbers if that's all they have.
Okay.
But here's the really cool part. When Isabel set up a conflict between numbers and quality, say 6 fish feeding slowly at one patch, and only 2 fish feeding rapidly at a richer patch.
What did the observers do then?
The 9-spine observers later swam to the richer patch, the one with only 2 fish but higher feeding rates.
Wow. So they prioritized the feeding success information over just the raw number of fish.
Exactly. It demonstrates that they preferentially use public information when it conflicts with numbers, showing they understand it's the more reliable indicator of actual patch quality.
That's really sophisticated decision-making for a tiny fish.
It really is. And this led researchers to explore further, like, how do 9-spines weigh these different sources of information when they conflict?
Right, because they have their own experiences too.
Precisely. Yif van Bergen, a PhD student at the time, did some really neat studies on this. She found sticklebacks are capable of surprisingly sophisticated adaptive trade-offs between relying on social versus asocial information.
How did she test that?
Well, in one experiment, Yif first gave 9-spines either reliable or unreliable personal training about which food patch was richer. Let them experience it themselves.
Okay, so they had some private info.
Right. Then she let them observe public information that conflicted with what they'd learned personally.
The classic conflict scenario. What happened?
What they found was fascinating. Fish that had reliable prior knowledge, they'd experienced the patch consistently. They almost completely ignored the conflicting public information. They stuck with their own private experience.
They trusted their own judgment.
Exactly. But the fish who had unreliable, noisy training, maybe the patches weren't consistently different during their training. They were much more inclined to copy the demonstrators.
So uncertainty pushed them towards social learning.
Yes. And the more unreliable their personal experience had been, the more likely they were to copy. It really speaks to this remarkable cognitive flexibility.
And she did another experiment related to this, about how old the information was.
Yeah, that was also very cool. Yeef manipulated the age of the Nine Spines' private training before giving them conflicting public info.
So how long ago they learned something themselves mattered.
It did. She found that fish would rely on their private information for maybe only about a day after training, but as their private info got older, more out of date, say after 3, 5, or 7 days, they increasingly copied the demonstrators instead.
And after a week.
When 7 days had passed since they last updated their private information, they switched completely. They relied totally on the current public information from the demonstrators.
That makes so much sense. If your own knowledge is stale, trust the fresh intel from others.
Exactly. So the key takeaway here is that Nine Spines are incredibly shrewd, aren't they? They're not just blindly copying all the time or randomly.
No, it's strategic.
Highly strategic. They're switching between relying on different information sources in a very sophisticated way. They use social information when their own experience is uncertain or unreliable or simply out of date.
And it gets even more nuanced, doesn't it? There was work by Jeremy Kendall on how they actually use that public info.
Yes, another postdoc, Jeremy Kendall. He found that Nine Spines apply this impressive hill climbing strategy when they exploit public information.
Hill climbing. What does that mean in this context?
It means fish that had some prior experience at one patch would actually switch their preference if they observed other fish having a higher prey capture rate somewhere else, suggesting a better alternative.
So they're constantly comparing and trying to move towards the better option.
Exactly. It allows them to steadily increase their foraging efficiency over time, sort of gradually homing in on the most profitable spots available. And the more the demonstrators were feeding, the higher the absolute rate, the more the observing fish copied.
That's amazing. It sounds like optimization.
It really is. And what's truly astonishing, perhaps the most striking finding, is that this specific behavior switching, when others' payoff rates are better, copying more when rates are higher, it precisely mirrors what sophisticated evolutionary game theory predicts.
Game theory, like the kind used to understand human economic decisions.
Precisely that. Theory initially developed by an economist to understand human behavior. Think about it. Two species as vastly different as humans, and these tiny nine-spine sticklebacks seem to exhibit the same optimal payoff-based learning rule when they copy.
That's wild. So it suggests a kind of underlying logic to learning.
It really does. It suggests this ratcheting quality to knowledge gain, where you build on existing information to improve. And that specific type of optimal copying hadn't really been clearly demonstrated in non-human animals before. It implies a shared fundamental principle of effective learning across species.
Wow. Okay, so we've seen how group dynamics and information quality affect things. But what about individual fish? Do their own circumstances matter, like, say, if they're male or female or ready to breed?
Absolutely. Individual state plays a huge role. Mike Webster's findings on the reproductive state in nine spines are particularly insightful here.
Okay, tell me about that. Let's start with females.
Right. Consider pregnant females. They're swollen with eggs, which makes them more conspicuous, more attractive to predators. They're also physically slower, less maneuverable.
So basically, higher risk all around.
Exactly. These changes effectively ratchet up the costs of that risky trial and error of social learning we talked about. So if you're a nine-spine female, pregnant and vulnerable,
you'd predict she'd rely even more on safe social information, right?
That was the prediction. Trust others, play it safe. It's that instinctive calculation of risk versus reward.
And did the experiments confirm that?
They did. Pregnant females relied almost exclusively on public information. They copied significantly more than non-reproductive fish. They made fewer switches between patches, less exploration, and they spent more time hiding in cover.
So their condition made them more risk-averse, pushing them heavily towards social learning.
Precisely. Now contrast that with reproductive males.
Okay, what's their situation?
Reproductive males are wired differently. They compete intensely with each other for females and good nesting territories, and they invest heavily in paternal care, guarding eggs, fanning them. This often ties them to their nest, making it hard to forage.
So they have different pressures.
Very different. Such circumstances tend to favor males who take risks, who actively seek out higher rewards through direct sampling of foraging sites. They need to build up energy reserves before they get tied down with parental duties.
So the prediction here would be the opposite. Less reliance on public information.
That was the prediction. Maybe even ignore it altogether and focus on finding the best spots themselves, quickly.
And the data
Supported it.
Yeah.
Reproductive males showed basically no evidence of public information use at all in these tests. They had the shortest patch selection times, the highest rates of switching between patches, lots of exploration, and spent the least time hiding in cover.
So much more bold, much more focused on individual exploration.
Exactly. And here's a fascinating twist. Reproductive males were actually quicker than non-reproductive fish at solving a foraging task when they were alone, just using trial and error.
Really? So it's not just that their focus shifted away from social learning.
It suggests it's not just a disruption of learning, but maybe an alternative adaptive strategy in itself. They switch modes to maximize their own food intake quickly before parental care kicks in.
Wow. So in that state, reproductive nine-spine males actually behave.
They behave very much like three spines.
That's incredible. It raises all sorts of questions about how maybe morphology or hormones mediate these strategic shifts in learning.
It certainly does. It shows how flexible these strategies can be, even within a species, depending on the individual's current state and priorities.
Okay, let's zoom out again. What does all this tell us about the bigger picture, the evolution of intelligence, maybe human uniqueness?
Well, Mike Webster's global collection work gives us clues about the evolutionary history. Remember, he sampled over 50 populations across 5 genera and 8 different stickleback species.
Yeah, the massive survey. What did that show about who uses public information?
He found that only 9 spines and their closest relative, their sister species, the brook stickleback, consistently exhibit public information use.
And the brook stickleback is similar physically.
Very similar morphology, yeah. Typically 5 or 6 small spines, no lateral plates, also vulnerable. None of the other more heavily armored stickleback species showed it.
So what does that timing suggest evolutionarily?
It implies that this specific capability likely evolved among the shared ancestors of nine-spine and brook sticklebacks after they diverged from the other stickleback lineages. We're talking maybe around 10 million years ago.
Okay, and what's truly fascinating here, you mentioned earlier, is this idea of convergent evolution.
Exactly. This finding is a really strong illustration of that. The mental abilities of animals aren't necessarily best explained by how closely related they are to us humans.
Right. It's not a simple ladder of intelligence with humans at the top.
Not at all. Instead, something like public information use seems to have evolved independently in very different groups. Humans, some birds, and these few fishes because they faced similar ecological pressures, a similar cost-benefit balance that favored this particular form of learning.
So it's about the adaptive problem and the selective pressures, not necessarily just shared on ancestry dictating cognitive abilities.
Precisely. And this whole body of research really drives home the point that animal social learning is broadly, perhaps even universally, strategic. It seems to be the rule, not the exception.
Can you give some other examples beyond sticklebacks?
Sure. Think about honeybees. They're more likely to follow the information in waggle dances if their own recent foraging trips have failed. Minnows, another fish, increase their copying of where others are feeding when the risk of predation is high.
Makes sense. Copying is safer then.
Right. Red-winged blackbirds actually consider the apparent health of the demonstrator bird when they're learning food preferences. Even chimpanzees are more likely to copy a dominant individual over a subordinate one.
And humans fit this pattern too.
Absolutely. We do it all the time. The simple rule, copy when uncertain, is a fundamentally smart strategic approach that humans employ constantly.
So these findings are really impressive, but they also open up new questions, don't they? New challenges for researchers.
They definitely do. One big challenge is realizing that animals don't just use one strategy. They seem to use many different social learning strategies, and they switch between them based on the current circumstances, just like the nine-spine switching based on reproductive state or information age.
So the new challenge is figuring out the rules for choosing the rules.
Exactly. Researchers are now talking about finding the rules that specify which rules should be used. They're calling them meta-strategies. That's a whole new level of complexity.
And what about the underlying mechanisms? How does this strategic copying actually work? Is it hardwired or learned?
That's another key question. Is strategic copying a direct biological adaptation? Or is it something animals learn to do? The stickleback studies offer some clues.
Like the fact nine spines focus on feeding strikes.
Right. The observation that nine spines seem specifically attuned to the feeding strikes of demonstrators, the actual rate of food capture, suggests that natural selection has likely fine-tuned their perceptual systems, their motivation, their information processing capabilities, specifically for this kind of social learning.
So maybe not a general enhancement of learning ability overall, but a specialized tool.
That's what it looks like, a specific adaptation for extracting public information about food.
And this deep dive, it really seems to highlight a crucial difference maybe between animal and human intelligence, doesn't it? The specialist versus generalist idea.
I think it does, yeah. While nine-spine sticklebacks are clearly specialists at using public information about food patches, they apparently can't generalize that skill to other contexts, like judging the quality of shelters based on others' behavior.
And the three spines couldn't even solve the food patch public information task, even though we know they're competent at other kinds of social learning.
Right. And this points to what seems to be a general pattern across the animal kingdom. Most animals are social learning specialists.
Meaning their abilities are very specific.
Very specific. Their capabilities seem tailored by natural selection to address particular adaptive challenges they face in their natural environment, and they usually operate in a comparatively narrow domain.
Can you give examples?
Sure. Macaques, for instance, readily acquire a fear of snakes through social learning, but not necessarily a fear of other random objects shown in the same way. Young male songbirds are primed to learn their own species' songs, but not usually the songs of other species.
So highly specific learning channels.
Exactly. But humans, we seem to be social learning generalists.
How so?
Well, our copying is strategic, as we've discussed, but it's seldom greatly constrained by specific competences linked to particular domains in the way animal learning often is. We can learn about, well, almost anything through observation and copying.
Like algebra, ballet steps, car mechanics.
Things that were absolutely not part of our species' evolutionary past or the specific adaptive challenges our ancestors faced.
And this generalist pattern extends beyond just learning.
It seems to. Think about communication. The honeybee's dance is incredibly sophisticated, but specific to food location and nest sites. Compare that to the open-ended nature of human language, or teaching. Meerkat helpers specifically teach pups how to handle dangerous prey, but they don't teach other forms of wisdom in the same structured way humans do.
Tool use, too.
Tool use is another great example.
Yeah.
New Caledonian crows are amazing tool users, but primarily for grubbing insects out of crevices. Humans use tools for an almost infinite range of tasks. In instance after instance, animal cognitive capabilities, while often impressive, seem specific. Their functionality largely restricted to the domains in which they evolved. That stands in marked contrast to the broad, flexible capacity we see in humans.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up this deep dive. The core learning seems to be that animals, and specifically these nine-spine sticklebacks, are exploiting information from others in a really strategic way.
Absolutely. Using sophisticated, even optimal rules that carefully balance risk and reward. It fundamentally challenges those simplistic perceptions of animal intelligence. Even tiny fish can be incredibly shrewd.
And it's also worth just briefly touching on that mutualistic relationship again, right? Between the nine spines and three spines.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating aspect. They often shoal together in the wild. The nine spines likely benefit from acquiring that public information, perhaps especially from the bolder three spines who might do more exploring.
And the three spines, what do they get out of it?
They likely enjoy the safety benefits of being in a larger group, especially since predators might preferentially target the more vulnerable nine spines mixed in the shoal. It's a potential win-win.
So this entire decades-long research program on sticklebacks really offers a profound takeaway, doesn't it? About how selection for more effective copying could have these bigger knock-on consequences.
For the evolution of the brain and cognition itself, yeah. It makes you wonder, how might these kinds of specific adaptive specializations, the ones leading to strategic learning in fish, how might they have paved the way, over evolutionary time, for the much more general capability to copy others that seems to characterize us humans?
That's the final provocative thought for you, our listener. What does this deep dive into the surprisingly complex social lives of fish suggest about the underlying cognitive machinery that allows